They didn't ask me. My sons simply gathered, like a board of directors, and started discussing who would get what after my death. Who would take the garage? Who'd claim the basement? Who would take mom for the holidays? Everything was decided without me because I was not quite myself anymore. But while they were busy dividing my house, I was quietly buying it back. And on the day of the deal, there was only one person in the room with full rights: me, their mother, the owner, not a faded figure in old photographs, but a woman with the keys. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Martha Willow. I was 69 years old when I first realized that being the eldest in the family no longer meant being respected. It meant being ignored with a smile. I had spent most of my adult life in a small, creaking two-story house in the Hudson Valley region of New York, the kind of home with crooked baseboards, a front porch that sighed when you stepped on it, and flower beds that needed more love than I could give them in recent years. I worked as a librarian for over 3 decades at the local branch, the kind of place where people still whispered and signed their names in hardbound ledgers. Books were my sanctuary. They never interrupted. They never talked down to me. After I retired, the house grew quieter. My husband had passed away 8 years earlier. The silence left behind by a long marriage is not loud, not sudden. It is patient. It creeps into the folds of curtains and the spaces between dinner plates. I lived alone, by choice, or so I told myself. My sons, Edward and Thomas, both had families of their own and busy lives far enough away to make their visits feel like events rather than routines. Edward, the older one, was steady, successful, always dressed as if headed to court, even when visiting on weekends. He worked in real estate finance and married young, to a woman I had yet to fully understand. Their 2 children were bright, scheduled, and polite in the way that made me wonder if they were told to be. Thomas, my younger son, was unpredictable, creative, untethered. One year he painted murals in Denver. The next he was editing video in Seattle. He had no children, no mortgage, no plan. Between the 2 of them, I had raised a fortress and a flame. After my small stroke in the spring, everything changed. Or maybe I changed. I recovered quickly, my speech intact, my memory clear. But Edward began to call more often. His tone was concerned, rehearsed. He asked questions that felt like they had answers already waiting. He brought me a blood pressure cuff. He sent me articles about aging safely at home. Then, without directly suggesting it, he began to make decisions, small at first, replacing my rug with a non-slip alternative, reorganizing my pantry so it was easier to navigate. I didn't argue. It felt easier not to. Then he started visiting more frequently. Sometimes he brought his wife, rarely the kids. Thomas called but didn't come. He always had a reason: flights, projects, gigs. But Edward came with folders. He showed me property listings for smaller homes, asked if I'd thought about downsizing, suggested that maybe the stairs were too much now. I told him I was fine. He smiled like a nurse tolerating a confused patient. One afternoon, he brought a man with him, an appraiser. Just to get a sense of the market, he said. Nothing binding. I stood in the doorway and watched as the stranger walked through my living room, making notes on a clipboard. He didn't remove his shoes. Later, Edward sat me down at the kitchen table and mentioned how it could make sense to begin thinking about distributing the property now, before anything unexpected happened. He used words like structure, equity, interests. I had worked in a library. I knew how to read between the lines. What he meant was this: I had become a variable in an equation, a piece to be managed. Still, I didn't protest. I said very little, actually. It was something I had learned over the years. that silence could be louder than a raised voice, that listening could be more dangerous than speaking. What struck me the most wasn't that he was trying to take control. It was that he believed it was already his, as if the years I spent tending that house, the marriage I built inside it, the books I read on that porch, the holidays I hosted in that narrow dining room, all of it had expired with my last paycheck. He referred to himself as the eldest often, as if the title carried automatic authority. I began to hear it as a kind of warning. The eldest knows best. The eldest should handle things. The eldest can take responsibility. But responsibility, I noticed, looked a lot like ownership when spoken in his tone. He believed I was fragile, that my quietness meant submission. That being the eldest woman in the family meant I would fold myself neatly into their plans and say thank you as they built a new life with my walls. But I wasn't just the eldest. I was the architect. I had chosen this house. I had buried my husband in this town. I had balanced checkbooks and raised sons and shelved every one of those books at the library with my own hands. I was not a detail to be managed. I began to pay closer attention, not out of fear, but out of precision. I noted the questions Edward asked and the ones he didn't. I started opening drawers I hadn't in years. I pulled out old paperwork, deeds, letters. I reread documents I once thought I'd never need again. I remembered the clauses, I saw the terms, and I began to understand just how much power I still held. Power that came not from confrontation, but from knowledge. He called me calm. He called me quiet. He thought it meant I was ready to let go. But the truth was, I wasn't quiet. I was preparing. It began with language, not the kind you hear in formal announcements or legal documents, but the soft, creeping kind that wraps itself around you before you realize you're being contained. Phrases like, "We're just thinking ahead," or "You shouldn't have to worry about these things," or "Let us handle it." It was always we, as if I had been gently ushered out of the circle of decision-makers and placed somewhere in the periphery, among things no longer expected to speak for themselves. Edward started showing up with a clipboard, not literally, but the way he walked through my house, noting what needed improving, what was outdated, gave the same energy. He asked how often I used the upstairs bathroom, commented on the worn banister, the creak in the floorboards outside my bedroom. He never said it outright, but the implication was clear. The house had aged, and so had I. And in his mind, both of us needed management. He brought a friend over one Saturday, a man with square glasses and a too-eager handshake. They called him a property consultant, but he didn't introduce himself to me. He went straight into the living room and began taking photos with his phone. I asked if something was wrong. Edward answered with a smile, saying it was just for reference. Reference for what? He didn't say. I noticed a pattern forming. When decisions were being made, they weren't called that. They were described in softened terms, washed clean of intent. I wasn't told they were preparing to shift ownership of the house. Instead, I was told they were exploring options. I wasn't told they wanted to evaluate the property's value. I was told they were getting a sense of things. I wasn't told that rooms were being claimed. I was told that it might make sense for certain parts of the house to be used more efficiently. It was a kind of linguistic fog, and I had lived long enough to know that fog always hides something solid underneath. The first time I saw the sketch, I was in the kitchen making tea. A piece of paper had fallen out of Edward's bag while he was speaking on the phone in the hallway. I picked it up and stared at it. A floor plan, my house drawn in clean black lines, labels beside each room. Studio, Tom. Workshop, Ed. Mother's room. Optional guest suite. No names, no explanation, just plans, assumptions. I placed the paper back on the table, quietly, and continued pouring my tea. My hands didn't shake, but my spine stiffened. They weren't calling anything what it was. They weren't calling it a takeover. They weren't calling it an inheritance. They weren't calling it erasure. But that's what it was. And I realized in that moment how easy it is to be replaced when no one uses your name. That same week, Tom called me after months of silence. His tone was warm, overly so, like a man trying to sell something. He asked how I was feeling, if I had been going to church, if I still made those perfect blueberry muffins. Then he asked about the garage, if I ever used it anymore. I told him I stored gardening tools there. He said something vague about potential, about having ideas. They all had ideas now, and none of them involved asking. One evening, I heard Edward and Tom speaking on the porch. They thought I was asleep. Edward was talking about tax implications, and Tom was asking about the quickest way to transfer title if something happened. Something, not someone. I was the something, a variable, an if. They spoke casually, efficiently, like businessmen negotiating over a property they had never built. Not once did they mention that the foundation had been laid by my husband's hands, that the soil in the backyard held pieces of my life, where I planted tomatoes, buried pets, watched storms pass while holding my boy's tiny fingers. And still, I said nothing. Not yet. Instead, I began to revisit old drawers. I found the folder labeled House, 1978 Present. It contained the original deed, the refinance papers, the tax statements. I reread the fine print. I paid attention to the language. My husband, years before he passed, had made sure my name remained primary on every legal form. His handwriting was still there, angular and steady. I made copies, quietly. I placed them in a new folder, a red one. They kept using words like streamline, modernize, restructure. They used these words instead of remove, replace, erase, because if they called it something else, they didn't have to face what they were doing. I understood this tactic. I had read enough fiction in my life to know how characters hide truths under euphemisms. I didn't correct them. I let them talk. I let them write lists, send emails, whisper behind walls. I let them believe I was fading into the background like wallpaper they were preparing to strip. But I wasn't wallpaper. I was the foundation. And they were forgetting how dangerous it can be to build something new without first asking who poured the concrete. So I watched. I listened. I wrote nothing down, but I remembered everything. If they wouldn't call things by their name, I would. I just wouldn't say it aloud yet. It was a Saturday in early November when they all arrived at the house together. Edward, Tom, and Tom's friend Jeremy, who called himself a property advisor, but carried himself more like a broker in search of a deal, not a home. They said they were there to check on a few things. They didn't say it was a meeting, but that's exactly what it was. 3 men standing in the living room of the house I had cared for, dissecting it like it belonged to them already. I watched from the top of the stairs, hidden by the railing, as they moved through each room with the casual entitlement of people who'd already made up their minds. Tom pointed to the den and said something about soundproofing. Edward paced slowly, arms crossed, making suggestions to Jeremy, who took notes. I couldn't hear every word, but I didn't need to. I could read their body language. They were planning, scheming. Not maliciously, perhaps, but with the confidence of those who had decided that someone else's space was theirs to arrange. They opened closet doors. They measured the width of the hallways. Jeremy even ran his hand along the baseboards in the dining room, as if appraising the quality of the wood. No one asked where I was. No one called my name. To them, I wasn't part of the process. I was the houseplant in the corner, alive, but mostly decorative. At some point, Edward unfolded a printed layout on the kitchen counter. It was a new version of the floor plan, different from the one I had seen weeks before. This one had more detail, more precision. He used a pen to point at areas marked in color: blue for Edward, green for Tom, gray for shared use. There was no color assigned to my room. There was no section labeled for me, not even a symbolic gesture. Tom asked something about converting the upstairs bathroom into a modern ensuite. Edward nodded. They laughed about how much they'd have to undo, joking that the house was stuck in the 80s. None of them mentioned who had painted the walls that color, who had chosen the tiles, who had cleaned that bathroom every week for 4 decades. When Jeremy stepped outside to take a call, Edward leaned in and lowered his voice, though not low enough. He told Tom that it was better to get things squared away now, in case something happened suddenly. He used the phrase again, just being practical. Practicality, it seemed, was the mask they wore while carving up the pieces of a life they hadn't built. Tom asked about paperwork. I heard the word transfer. I heard living trust. I heard probate. These were not the words of sons discussing care. These were the words of men managing an asset. When Jeremy returned, he suggested scheduling a full inspection, said he had a guy who could do it cheap and discreetly. Edward agreed. Tom mentioned that he'd already priced out renovations for the basement. He smiled when he said it, like he'd done something clever. I had heard enough. I walked quietly back to my bedroom, sat down at my desk, and looked at the small brass key in the top drawer, the one that opened the fireproof lockbox where I kept the originals: deed, insurance, my husband's letters. Everything they assumed was just paper and dust. They didn't understand the gravity of what they were doing, or maybe they did and just didn't care. They saw me as a loose end, a complication to be resolved, a future absence they had already priced into their calculations. But they had made a mistake. They assumed silence meant surrender. That age meant irrelevance. That motherhood came with a natural expiration date. Later that afternoon, I came downstairs. The floorboards creaked, and the sound broke their conversation. They turned, startled for a moment, then relaxed into smiles, tight, polite, insincere. Edward asked if I was feeling okay. I said yes. Tom asked if I needed anything. I said no. I sat down on the love seat and folded my hands. I didn't ask what they were doing. I didn't demand an explanation. I simply looked at each of them, one by one, until their expressions wavered under the weight of their own discomfort. Jeremy checked his watch and said he had to leave. Tom followed him out, saying they'd be in touch. Edward lingered for a moment, as if waiting for me to start a conversation. When I didn't, he adjusted his coat and left without another word. The house fell silent again. Not the silence of loss, not the silence of being forgotten. This was a different kind of quiet, the stillness that comes just before a decision, just before a storm. They thought there were 3 men and 1 house, but they had miscounted. There were 4 of us, and only one of us held the original key. The basement had always been mine, though no one else in the family would have said so. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't the kind of place people showed off. But it was mine in the way a person quietly claims a space by returning to it over and over, layering it with habits and memory. It was where I kept the old cedar chest filled with winter blankets, where I stored jars of homemade apple butter no one asked for anymore. It was where I stood for hours during storms, watching the tiny glass window for signs of water creeping through the concrete. That basement had held laundry baskets, broken furniture, 1,000 folded Sunday mornings. It had been my workshop when the boys were young, and the place where I cried when their father died. Now, according to Tom's designs, it was his future art studio. The plan had been drafted in detail: soundproofing, track lighting, ventilation. He had gone so far as to make a Pinterest board, which I stumbled upon when his laptop was open on the dining room table. I saw sketches of shelves, racks for supplies, an espresso machine tucked in the corner. The phrase "clean lines, open energy" was typed beneath an image of whitewashed walls. He hadn't asked if he could take the space. He had assumed. That was worse. I didn't say anything to him. Instead, I took a walk to the bank. I met with a loan officer named Cynthia, who looked at me with the pleasant, practiced expression of someone trained to speak softly to the elderly. I let her go through her usual questions before I placed a folder in front of her. Inside were the property documents, originals, dated and signed, with my name printed in firm black ink. I explained that I wanted to transfer funds from my savings to initiate a private transaction. No loans, no mortgage, just a purchase. Cynthia asked for details, so I gave them. I told her I wished to purchase my younger son's share of the property, as outlined in the arrangement my husband and I had made years ago. She hesitated, asked if I had legal counsel. I smiled and gave her the business card of the attorney I'd already spoken to the day before. I had been busy in my silence. Tom didn't resist when I brought it up. He needed money. He always did. I approached him carefully, told him I understood his dreams, that perhaps it would be simpler if we formalized things now. He seemed surprised but grateful. He agreed quickly without suspicion. I'm sure he thought it was some last act of maternal generosity, that I was clearing the way for him. And maybe I was, but not in the way he thought. The paperwork moved swiftly. Tom signed it without reading most of it. The attorney handled everything. The transfer was clean. By the end of the week, I legally owned the portion of the house Tom had assumed was already his. That included the basement. The irony didn't escape me. While Tom planned to repaint the walls and hang his canvases, I had rewritten the deed. While he measured floor space, I had measured the weight of legal leverage. While he picked out pendant lights, I had picked up the phone and exercised a right no one remembered I had. When the documents arrived, I held them in my hands for a long time. They felt heavier than they looked. Ownership was not a feeling I had expected to reclaim, but there it was, printed in perfect font, notarized and sealed. My name beside a new percentage. I was no longer a cohabitant. I was a majority stakeholder. In silence, with precision, I had changed the structure of the entire house, and no one even noticed. Tom emailed me later that week, attaching updated drawings of his studio. He said he was excited to start clearing out the basement now that things were moving forward. I didn't respond right away. I waited. When I finally did, I kept it short. We should talk before you make any changes to the basement. There have been some updates. He didn't reply. Instead, I heard him pull into the driveway 2 days later, his footsteps loud on the porch. He knocked once, then opened the door without waiting. I met him in the hallway, folder in hand. I didn't lecture him. I didn't gloat. I simply handed him a copy of the document. He skimmed it, then stared at me. He asked why I had done it. I told him it was a matter of clarity. I told him I needed to protect what was mine. He didn't argue. He left without saying goodbye. After he was gone, I descended the basement steps slowly, one hand on the railing. I stood at the bottom and looked around. The dim light from the ceiling bulb flickered, but I didn't mind. The space smelled of dust and old paper. It was quiet, unassuming, imperfect. It was mine. I began moving things, reorganizing, reclaiming. I brought down my sewing machine, my gardening tools, the photo albums no one ever asked to see. I swept the floor, wiped the walls, dusted the shelves. The basement didn't need soundproofing or pendant lights. It needed a name again. And this time, it would be mine. There's something final about a signature. Not the act of writing it, but what it carries: intention, ownership, decision. I had signed my name thousands of times in my life. Permission slips, checks, receipts, library cards, sympathy notes. But that signature, the one I placed on the final document of the property transfer, felt different. It felt like a full stop after a sentence no one realized I had been writing for years. After I acquired Tom's share, I moved with quiet efficiency. I scheduled a meeting with the attorney to adjust the title and revise the ownership document. It wasn't dramatic. No bold headlines, no announcement. Just a reshuffling of papers in a modest office with beige walls and a ticking clock. The paralegal notarized my signature, stamped it, and handed me the copy. That was it. But everything had changed. The house now belonged to me, legally, indisputably, and silently. I held the majority. With Tom's share added to mine, I now owned 2/3 of the home. Edward still held his portion, but it was no longer enough to make decisions without me. And more importantly, no one had seen it coming. They assumed everything was still suspended in some gray zone, waiting for consensus or crisis. I didn't rush to tell them, not because I was hiding anything, but because I had learned that silence was a form of strength they didn't know how to read. I watched them continue their plans, still operating under the belief that I was gently stepping aside. I let them speak in vague terms about eventual transitions and sensible restructuring. I nodded when they referenced me in the third person while I stood in the same room. It was a strange sensation, being invisible in your own home, but it had its uses. One evening, Edward brought over a folder labeled Long-Term Planning. He sat at the kitchen table like a man running a board meeting and began explaining the benefits of transferring ownership early. He used phrases like asset optimization and simplifying tax exposure. He laid out a chart with bullet points, some of which included lines like Mom retains limited usage rights and establish living trust with co-beneficiaries. I watched him carefully as he spoke. He didn't notice the small smile forming at the corners of my mouth. He had no idea that the document he wanted me to sign was no longer relevant, that my signature, the only one that mattered now, had already been placed on a different document, in a different room, with a different purpose. He reached the final page and slid it toward me, along with a pen. I picked it up, read the page slowly, and set the pen down. I didn't say no. I didn't need to. I simply told him I wanted to review it further. His mouth tightened slightly, but he nodded, said he understood, and packed his papers back into the folder. The next morning, I called the county office and requested an updated property statement. When it arrived in the mail a few days later, I opened it carefully and placed it in a fresh envelope. I didn't send it. I left it on the side table in the hallway, between the lamp and the photo of my wedding day. I wanted it nearby, not to flaunt, but to remind myself that power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it hides in a drawer until it's ready to be revealed. Tom texted a few times about the basement after our conversation. He asked if he could still use it occasionally, suggested a few dates for painting. I replied politely but firmly that the space was now being used. He didn't press. Maybe he had sensed the shift. Maybe he didn't want to know the details. The next Sunday, Edward brought his family over for dinner. Sandra complimented the roast. The kids sat on their phones. Edward was quieter than usual, distracted. At one point, he asked about the title transfer. I told him I had been reviewing it and that I had made a few decisions on my own. He paused, mid-chew, and looked up. He asked what I meant. I said I had taken steps to secure the future of the house in a way that made sense for me, that everything was in order, that there was nothing more for him to arrange. He didn't speak for a long moment. I saw it then, the realization flickering in his eyes, the slow understanding that the control he thought he was gradually inheriting had never truly been his, that while he had been writing outlines, I had already signed the final draft. He asked if I wanted to discuss it. I said not tonight, maybe another time. The room was silent for a beat too long. Then Sandra changed the subject to school enrollment. and the moment passed. Later that night, I sat in my bedroom with the signed deed in front of me. I traced my name with my fingertip. It didn't look extraordinary, just ink on paper, but it held everything, years of effort, of restraint, of wisdom. It held the quiet refusal to be erased. They never saw the signature coming because they never thought I still had a pen in my hand. But I did. I always did. And now that signature was more than a name. It was a declaration. This was my house, and no one would write me out of it again. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I decided it was time. Not a holiday, not a birthday, not any particular occasion that would give the meeting weight or ceremony. Just an ordinary day. The kind of day they would forget, unless I gave them a reason not to. That's how I wanted it. No drama, no shouting, just the sound of paper sliding across a table and the silence that follows realization. I called Edward that morning and asked if he could stop by in the evening. I said it plainly, without urgency or invitation, and he agreed. Tom happened to be in town for a gallery show that week, so I asked him to come too. I told them I wanted to talk about the house. I used their language, planning, clarity, alignment. I didn't mention decisions. I didn't mention authority. I let them believe they still had room to steer something. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing the dining room. I cleared the table, wiped the wood with lemon oil, and arranged the documents in a neat stack. Title papers, the deed, the certified copies from the county, and a summary page typed in 12-point font with bullet points. I didn't want them to get lost in legal language. I wanted them to read what mattered and understand it without excuses. The light outside began to dim as evening crept in. I didn't cook anything. No coffee, no wine. This wasn't a social visit. I wore a simple navy blouse and sat in my usual place at the head of the table, facing the door. When Edward arrived, he looked surprised to find the lights on, but no dinner. He gave a polite smile, glanced at the papers, and sat down cautiously. Tom came in 5 minutes later, wearing a wool scarf and smelling faintly of paint thinner. He looked more tired than usual. We exchanged pleasantries, brief and mechanical. Then I gestured to the stack in front of me and said, "Let's begin." I slid the first page across the table toward Edward. His eyes moved quickly, scanning for the familiar. His fingers tapped on the edge of the table, a nervous tick I hadn't seen since he was a boy, trying to explain away a bad grade. Tom leaned in to read over his shoulder. I waited. They reached the second page together, the one with the title Revision and the date of the official transfer. Tom frowned. Edward blinked and reread the same line. Then he looked up. There was a stillness between us, the kind that only comes when something previously assumed becomes undeniably false. Edward asked if this was finalized. I nodded. Tom asked when. I told him the date. Edward's voice tightened. He asked why I hadn't told them. I replied that I wasn't required to, that I had the right, that I exercised it. There was no argument, not right away, just silence. I watched them both come to terms with the fact that the structure they had been quietly building, the plans, the division, the timelines, was standing on land that no longer belonged to them, not even partly. Edward tried to reframe it. He said things like, "This complicates things," and "We just want what's best for you." But the words felt brittle, rehearsed, useless. I told them that the house was mine, that I had no plans to sell, that any further conversation about the property would go through me, on my terms. Tom asked if I was angry. I told him no. That anger was what happened when people still expected something from you. What I felt was beyond that. What I felt was done. They didn't yell. There were no slammed doors, no insults, just discomfort. Just the realization that a door they thought was wide open had been gently but completely closed. Before they left, I offered them each a copy of the document. Neither reached for it, so I set them down on the end of the table, folded once, and waited until they left before picking them up again and placing them back in the drawer. Later, after the house had gone quiet again, I returned to the table and sat in the same spot, hands folded in my lap. I looked at the grain of the wood, at the indentations made by years of elbows and forks and coffee cups. I thought of all the nights I had listened instead of spoken, all the times I had been thanked but never heard, all the meetings about my life where I was not present. Not anymore. Now they had the facts. The documents were on the table. And for the first time in a long time, I was the only one in the room with nothing to explain. After the papers were read, and the silence had stretched itself across the room like a heavy curtain, I noticed a shift, not just in my sons, but in myself. Something had settled. Not satisfaction exactly, not triumph, but a certainty that took up space. For years I had felt like wallpaper in my own house, present but unnoticed, decorative at best. That ended the moment the documents hit the table. Now I was not the background. I was the frame. The following week passed without calls, no follow-ups, no questions, no drop-ins under the pretense of errands. I thought it would feel lonely, but it didn't. It felt clean, still. I spent those days walking slowly through the house as if I were rediscovering it. Not just the rooms, but the roles I had played inside them. In the kitchen, I had once been a caretaker. In the living room, a mediator. In the hallway, a ghost. Now I was a resident again. I changed the locks. It wasn't out of anger or fear. It was out of logic. A boundary had been crossed too many times with too much ease. No one had knocked in years. They walked in because they believed they could. Because they believed I wouldn't mind. I had minded. I had just never said it out loud. Now I didn't need to. The lock said it for me. I began reclaiming spaces in small ways. I moved my sewing machine into the room that had once been Tom's, back when he was still a boy and believed in rock bands and running away to California. I found his old posters still rolled up in the closet. I didn't throw them out. I just pushed them to the side and stacked fabric where his dreams used to live. In Edward's old room, I set up a reading corner, a proper one with a comfortable chair, a lamp with warm light, and a side table for my tea. I brought up my favorite books from the basement and dusted them off like old friends returning from exile. I opened the windows. I let fresh air into corners that had grown stagnant. I rearranged the furniture. I donated old dishes. I took down photos I didn't like anymore, not out of spite, but because they didn't reflect who I was now. There had been too many years where the walls told a story about a woman who always smiled, always hosted, always said yes. That story had ended. One morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and cut my hair. Nothing drastic, just enough to feel the shift. I looked at my reflection and saw someone I hadn't seen in a while. Someone whose silence had not been weakness, but a strategy. Someone who had endured not because she had to, but because she was watching, waiting, choosing. A few neighbors noticed the changes. One asked if I was renting the house out now, since they hadn't seen my sons around. I smiled and said no, that it was just me, that it had always been me. Really? She didn't know what to say. People rarely do when you take back something they never realized you'd lost. Sandra emailed me, just a few lines. Polite, clipped, almost professional in tone. She asked if everything was all right between the family. She said the children missed me. I responded with equal formality. I told her the house was mine, that I was fine, that visits were welcome, by invitation, that I was no longer interested in surprises. It was hard for her, I think, to picture me as someone with terms. I had always been the flexible one, the one who bent, the one who waited. But the thing about bending too long is that eventually you become either brittle or unbreakable. I had chosen the latter. Edward eventually returned, alone. He came one afternoon and knocked. He waited on the porch. He looked smaller than I remembered, less certain. I opened the door and stood in the frame. We didn't speak right away. When he finally did, he said he understood, that he didn't mean to take anything from me. I believed that. He hadn't wanted to steal. He had simply assumed there was nothing left to give, that I had already given it all away. I told him I hadn't, that I still had myself, and that was something worth protecting. He nodded. He didn't ask to come in, and I didn't invite him. Later that evening, I sat in the dining room, the same table where they once made plans without me. Now, the only paper on it was a list I had written in my own hand. Things to change, things to keep, things to finally say no to. It was a simple list, but it was mine. I lit a candle, not for ambiance, for ceremony, because there are moments in a woman's life that deserve acknowledgement, even if no one else sees them. Taking back a house, taking back a voice, taking back a name not followed by Mom or Mrs. or Dear. I was not the wall they leaned on, not the floor they walked over, not the soft chair they collapsed into when the world was unkind. I was the owner of this house, and I didn't need a key to prove it. I was already inside. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was full. It echoed with my own voice again, even when I wasn't speaking. I walked barefoot across the floors, and with every step, I felt the ground return to me. It wasn't just about ownership, it was about presence. I wasn't passing through the rooms anymore. I was living in them. I wasn't waiting for something to happen. I was shaping what came next. There was a comfort in the routine I built for myself. Mornings with black coffee and toast on the sunlit edge of the porch. Afternoons in the back garden, gloves damp with soil as I turned over earth that hadn't been touched in seasons. Evenings with the radio humming low and the smell of soup warming on the stove. Everything small felt valuable again. Not borrowed, not shared, not held in hesitation. Mine. When I opened drawers, they held only what I wanted to keep. When I pulled books from shelves, they were ones I had chosen, not relics of someone else's opinions. I rearranged the living room so that the chair faced the window, not the television. I replaced the rug in the hall with one that reminded me of the library I used to work in. Sturdy, soft, and grounded in silence. The doorbell rang less often, but when it did, I decided who came in. That decision, simple as it sounds, carried more weight than anyone could imagine. I had started locking the door at dusk, not because I feared the dark, but because I finally believed I had something worth protecting. Not just things, but boundaries. Not just walls, but selfhood. I didn't owe anyone my space anymore. If they wanted it, they had to ask. And asking, I had learned, was something people rarely did when they believed they were entitled. The house, once a quiet museum of memories, became a place of motion again. I hosted the local book club in the dining room, served pastries from recipes no one else remembered but me. I invited the neighbor's daughter to bake with me on Saturdays, her small hands covered in flour, her laugh echoing down the hall in a way that reminded me of a younger time without pulling me back into it. It didn't feel like loss. It felt like continuity. One afternoon, Tom called. His voice was hesitant, uncertain. He said he was thinking of visiting and asked if it would be all right. Just that, if it would be all right. It was the first time he had ever phrased it as a question. I told him yes, and when he arrived the next day, he waited on the porch, hands in his pockets, eyes searching mine for something he couldn't name. I opened the door and let him in, not because I had to, but because I chose to. We didn't talk about the basement. We didn't talk about the plans. We talked about the garden, about the smell of spring coming early, about how some things take root without anyone noticing. Edward visited 2 weeks later. He brought his daughter with him this time, and I watched as she ran through the hallway she used to be afraid of. She was taller now, quieter. She asked if I still had the teacups we used for our pretend parties. I did. I had packed them away gently when I thought no one would ever ask again. Now, I placed them on the table without ceremony, and we sipped warm apple juice like it was gold. After they left, I sat alone for a while. I looked around the room and listened to the clock ticking, the trees brushing against the window, the sound of a house that was still breathing with me inside it. I thought about all the years I spent being careful not to take up too much space, about how often I bit my tongue so others could speak, about how I was told that aging meant shrinking, softening, stepping aside. But I hadn't stepped aside. I had stepped forward. This house was no longer a gift I gave without condition. It was no longer a quiet place for others to make noise. It was no longer a structure I stood inside while others made the rules. This house asked now, and if someone wanted something, my time, my room, my space, they would have to knock. They would have to wait. They would have to ask. Because I was no longer the background. I was the threshold, and in this house they would ask.